The chain was thick as a man's thumb and wrapped twice around a steel post sunk deep in the frozen Manitoba earth. For the Belgian Malinois, curled beneath the overhang of a rusted horse trailer, shaking in the -34 wind chill of a January night outside Portage-la-Prairie, the war had not ended in the dust of the Sahel. It had ended here, sold for $85. His military designation was W09. His handler, Master Corporal Saoirse Gallagher, was 1,800 kilometers away in Kingston, Ontario, staring at her phone at 2 in the morning. She hadn't slept through a full night in 14 months. The titanium plate in her left femur ached when the temperature dropped, and the temperature in Kingston had been dropping steadily since November. She was 28 years old and moved like someone twice that age, and she had spent the last 7 months filing adoption requests with the Department of National Defense that were reviewed, stamped, and quietly shelved by a man who had never once set foot outside a climate-controlled office building. The dog she was looking for had survived 4 IED sweeps in Kandahar, 2 ambushes in Mali's Mopti region, and a rooftop engagement near Bamako that had left Saoirse with a shattered femur, a fractured pelvis, and a 6-centimeter shard of metal embedded in her lower back. He had held his ground over her body for 11 minutes, while the medevac fought through dust and small arms fire to reach them. His name, his real name, the one she had given him on their first day of pre-deployment workup at CFB Trenton, was Gunner. Gunner had been a Belgian Malinois of exceptional build, compact and precise as a wound spring. His tan and black coat was dense against the cold, his amber eyes quick and surgical in their attention. He had been certified in explosive ordnance detection and patrol work at 17 months old, and had completed 3 operational tours with Joint Task Force 2, Canada's Tier 1 Special Operations Unit. He was, in every practical measure, one of the most decorated working dogs the Canadian Armed Forces had produced in a decade. The morning Saoirse was loaded onto the Globemaster III at Bamako-Senu International Airport. Gunner had been taken from her hands by the logistics corporal on site. She remembered clutching the fabric loop of his vest as the stretcher was lifted, remembered the way his paws scrambled on the tarmac as they separated him from her. She had been conscious enough to say his name twice before the morphine took over. What followed was 14 months of surgeries, physiotherapy sessions at the Ottawa Rehabilitation Centre, and an administrative labyrinth that no amount of determination could seem to cut through. Because Gunner was technically assessed as physically sound at the time of her evacuation, his coat clean, his weight good, his hips showing no degeneration, the DND's Asset Management Office had categorized him as transferable and rotated him to Meridian Security Solutions, a private contractor handling perimeter detection work for federal installations across Western Canada. The man responsible for that transfer was a senior procurement officer named Harley Bassett. He managed fleet vehicles and contracted assets from a spreadsheet in a Gatineau office park. He had approved Gunner's reassignment with a single line-item entry, Working Animal W09, transferred to Meridian Security Solutions, effective January 14. Saoirse's adoption applications, 3 of them, filed from a hospital bed at the Ottawa General, had been received, acknowledged by automated reply, and quietly shelved. For 2 years, Gunner worked perimeter sweeps at a federal port authority in Prince Rupert, British Columbia. He was efficient, methodical, and largely invisible. The handlers at Meridian rotated every 6 months, so no single person ever learned to read the slight flick of his left ear that meant he had caught a scent worth investigating. No one noticed that he tracked the flight paths of low-flying aircraft with his eyes the way a retired soldier tracks the sound of boots on pavement, alert, involuntary, waiting for a signal that never came. When Gunner's hip X-rays came back showing early bilateral dysplasia, common in working dogs of his age and operational mileage, Meridian's operations manager signed the retirement paperwork without hesitation. reclassified as non-operational equipment, bundled in a D&D surplus auction alongside decommissioned radio gear and 2 sets of expired body armor. He went under the gavel in Winnipeg on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Earl Doucette had driven 4 hours from Portage-la-Prairie for the auction. He ran a hunting operation, waterfowl and big game, and wanted a dog that could guard his outbuildings and scare off coyotes in winter. He didn't know much about Belgian Malinois, except that they were expensive dogs, and he had found one for $85. He loaded Gunner into the bed of his half-ton and drove home. That night, Gunner was chained to a steel post behind the barn. Earl fed him irregularly, scraps from his own table when he remembered, nothing when he didn't. The chain allowed exactly 3 meters of movement in any direction. There was no shelter except the overhang of the horse trailer parked nearby, which Gunner had learned to press himself against when the wind came in off the open fields from the northwest. His coat was matted and salt-stained from the frozen ground. His hips flared with pain at anything below -20, which in January near Portage-la-Prairie was most nights. But his amber eyes still tracked the tree line at the edge of Earl's property, with the same unhurried precision they had tracked doorways in Kandahar. And every time an aircraft passed low over the fields, a crop duster in the warmer months, a medevac helicopter during hunting season, Gunner would lift his head and hold very still, as though waiting for something he understood might never come. He was still on duty, he simply had no post to hold. It was a photograph taken through the windshield of a snowplow that changed everything. The driver, a highway maintenance worker named Glenn Proctor, had pulled off the Trans-Canada to eat his lunch at the edge of a gravel turnoff near Doucette's property. He had noticed the dog through the fence line, the way it stood stock-still in the wind, too disciplined to be a farm dog, too composed to be what it was clearly being used as. He zoomed in on his phone, took 3 shots, and that evening posted them in a Facebook group called Forgotten Military and Service Dogs, Canada. The caption read, "Eating lunch on the Trans-Canada outside Portage-la-Prairie today, and noticed this dog chained behind a farm operation, too lean, standing at attention in -30 like he's waiting for orders, has what looks like a green tattoo inside his left ear. Anyone out that way know if there's a rescue nearby." The post had 47 comments by midnight. By 1 in the morning it had been shared into a second group, then a third. At 2:07 a.m. it reached Saoirse Gallagher's phone. She had been awake anyway, reading nothing in particular, staring at the ceiling of her apartment near CFB Kingston. The notification appeared as a share from a woman she had never met. She almost didn't open it. Then she saw the thumbnail. The photograph was grainy, taken at distance through a dirty windshield in low winter light, but there was no mistaking the particular posture, the square, level shoulders, the deliberate stillness that was not the stillness of a cold animal, but of a trained one, and across the bridge of his snout, barely visible in the image, but unmistakable to Saoirse, the faint pale diagonal of old scar tissue where shrapnel had grazed him in Bamako. She sat up. Her hand was shaking when she enlarged the image, not from the nerve damage in her left hand, from something else entirely. She did not call the RCMP. She had considered it for approximately 45 seconds before discarding the idea entirely. Calling the RCMP meant reports, inquiries, and a legal process that would classify Gunner as illegally purchased property and likely result in his removal to a shelter while the matter was reviewed. An $85 dog legally transferred, without dispute at the time of sale. In a shelter, a high-drive Belgian Malinois with bite training and zero socialization history, since Meridian would be assessed as a liability inside 72 hours. She was not leaving Gunner to another institution. She scrolled to a contact in Edmonton and dialed. It rang twice. Gallagher. The voice was level, accustomed to receiving calls at unusual hours. The name was Reed Thorpe. He was 31, a former JTF2 sniper who had transitioned to private security consulting after his second knee surgery. He had been on the rooftop in Bamako. He had been 40 meters back when Saoirse went down, and he had watched Gunner hold that perimeter until the medevac finally came in. He had never spoken about it directly. He didn't need to. "I found him," Saoirse said. A silence on the line. Reed knew exactly what him meant. There was only one person Saoirse Gallagher had been searching for since she came off the surgical table. Where? A hunting operation outside Portage-la-Prairie. Some guy bought him at the D&D auction. He's chained outside. "Reed, it's -32 tonight." She heard him exhale, a slow, controlled breath that was the closest Reed Thorpe ever came to expressing anything that could be called distress. "I'll call Luke," he said, "and Janelle. Luke can drive from Moncton to Montreal and pick Janelle up. They can be in Winnipeg by tomorrow night if they leave now. I'll book the first flight out of Edmonton. We meet you on the perimeter highway outside the city." "Reed, this isn't a sanctioned operation. We're walking onto private property in the middle of the night. Breaking and entering, theft of property under Manitoba law." Reed's pause was very brief. "Saoirse, that dog pulled you out of a kill zone and held your perimeter for 11 minutes. You tell me right now, do we leave that behind?" She closed her eyes. "No." "Then I'll see you in Winnipeg. Bring your trauma kit." Luc Arsenault was a 34-year-old former JTF2 breacher from Moncton, built like a reinforced door and quiet as a reading room. He had Janelle Cotte on the phone before Reed had finished the call to him. Janelle was 29, a former Special Operations medical technician from Longueuil, Quebec, who had completed 2 tours with JTF2 before transitioning to urgent care at a Montreal trauma center. She had treated Saoirse's field wounds in the first 10 minutes after Bamako. She had also closed the laceration across Gunner's muzzle while they waited for the evacuation helicopter, stitching under fire with steady hands because the dog had protected her handler, and she would not leave that unacknowledged. She packed her kit without asking questions. She was downstairs waiting at the curb when Luke's truck pulled up at 4:15 in the morning. Saoirse drove the 1,700 kilometers from Kingston in a single long push, stopping twice for fuel and once at a Tim Hortons outside Sudbury for coffee she barely tasted. She crossed into Manitoba in the early afternoon, the prairies opening up around her into a flat grey infinity of frozen fields and pale sky. She pulled into a motel on the perimeter highway outside Winnipeg at 8:30 that evening. Reed's rental was already parked outside. He was leaning against the hood with his arms crossed, breath fogging steadily in the cold. Luke and Janelle arrived 20 minutes later. No one said much. They had been in enough cold staging areas together that the silence felt purposeful rather than awkward. Luke had printed satellite imagery of Doucette's property on the drive over. He spread it on the hood of Saoirse's truck under the parking lot lights. "Main house here, older bungalow, back from the highway about 400 meters," he said, tracing the layout. "Outbuildings cluster northeast, barn, equipment shed, secondary storage. The horse trailer Proctor photographed is in the northeast quadrant. Chain post location matches the image." "One occupant," Saoirse said, "Earl Doucette. No evidence of employees or family on site." "We go in off the side road," Reed said. "Park at the tree break 300 meters out. Luke, you take the fence line at the northeast corner. Janelle, eyes on the house. I cover. Saoirse goes straight to the dog." "And if Doucette comes outside?" Janelle asked. Saoirse looked at the map for a moment. "We don't engage unless he escalates. The goal is Gunner. We get him, and we go. We are not here to start anything." She meant it, but she had also spent 7 months watching every legal channel she had tried be received, acknowledged, and quietly ignored by a procurement officer who looked at a decorated military working dog and saw a line item in a spreadsheet. There was a particular stillness in her voice that everyone at that hood recognized. It was the same stillness Gunnar had shown on the rooftop in Bamako. They moved at 1:30 a.m. The cold was savage, -34, with a wind off the open fields that stripped warmth from exposed skin in seconds. They parked at the tree break and moved on foot across the hard frozen ground, their footsteps barely registering on the crusted snow. Luke reached the perimeter fence first, standard 5-wire agricultural, and had it folded back in under a minute with insulated cutters. He held it open and they passed through one at a time, angling toward the northeast outbuildings. The property was dark except for a sodium light above the barn door that cast an orange circle on the frozen ground. The house was quiet. Saoirse moved ahead. The horse trailer was visible from 20 meters, a rusted flat deck pressed against the northeast fence line, and beneath its overhang, curled on the bare frozen ground with the logging chain dark against the pale snow crust, was a dog. She stopped. Even at this distance, in this cold, the posture was unmistakable. That precise configuration of spine and haunches she had watched sleep under a field cot in a phobie in Kandahar, the first thing she had reached for every morning before she reached for her rifle. She walked forward slowly, crouching as she approached. The wind shifted, and the snow crunched once beneath her boot. The dog's head came up instantly. Even starved, even stiff with cold, the reaction was immediate and total. Gunnar rose to his feet in a single controlled motion and issued a warning that was not quite a bark, a low, sustained sound that vibrated in the chest rather than the ears. His stance was wide and deliberate, weight shifted forward, positioned between the intruder and the trailer, a guard dog's posture, a soldier's posture. Saoirse stopped 8 meters away. She pulled off her right glove and tucked it in her pocket. She held out her bare hand, palm up and open, at waist height. Then she used the voice she had used in doorways in Kandahar and in compounds in Mali's Mopti region, quiet, level, with an edge of command underneath it that bypassed instinct and went directly to training. W9, stand down, handler on deck. The warning sound stopped. Complete silence. Gunnar stood absolutely motionless. His ears, which had been flattened in threat display, rotated forward and locked. His nose worked rapidly, short, staccato pulls of frigid air, sifting through the scent of frozen earth and motor oil and old rust for something his brain hadn't processed in 14 months. Then he found it. The chain hit the snow with a metallic rasp as Gunnar lurched forward. His hind legs, the hip dysplasia visible now obvious in the way the left leg dragged slightly on the frozen crust, buckled once, but he corrected and kept moving. He covered the 8 meters between them, in a stumbling, desperate push that bore no resemblance to the precise, controlled gait she had watched for 3 years in the field. He made a sound she had never heard from him before. Not a bark and not a whine. Something between the two, fractured and urgent, beginning high and breaking partway through, the sound of an animal that has been holding something clenched for a very long time and has just been given permission to release it. Saoirse went to her knees in the snow. She caught him with both arms as he came in, pressing her face into the side of his neck, into the matted and ice-crusted fur that smelled of rust and cold earth, and underneath it, just barely, the particular warm animal scent she had memorized without knowing she was memorizing it. Gunnar pressed his full weight against her chest, his tail moving weakly against the snow, his tongue finding her jaw and her cheekbone and the scar at the corner of her eye, every centimeter of her face accounted for, confirmed, real. She held on. Her tears froze before they got far. The wind didn't stop. "I've got you," she said very quietly, her voice not carrying more than a foot in the cold. "I've got you, Gunnar. You're relieved. You hear me? You're done holding the line." Behind her, Reed Thorpe stood with his back to them, watching the tree line. His jaw was set and his eyes were dry, which required some effort on his part. Luke appeared at Saoirse's shoulder with the hydraulic cutters. He crouched without a word, examined the padlock securing the chain to the post, positioned the cutter jaws, and looked up. "This lock is garbage," he said quietly. "Ready." The padlock dropped into the snow in 2 seconds. Gunnar lifted his head at the sound, shook once, and pressed back into Saoirse. "Package secured," Luke said into his earpiece. "Janelle, status on the house?" "Light on in the back." Janelle came back immediately. "Someone's up." They were already moving. Saoirse, with her arm around Gunnar, half supporting his weight, as the freed dog worked to match pace on hips that had gone unmanaged for over a year. They were 20 meters from the fence line when the barn light clicked off and a second source swept the northeast corner. A handheld flashlight, powerful and deliberate. "Hold right there." Earl Doucette's voice carried clearly across the yard. He was in an insulated canvas jacket and unlaced work boots, the flashlight in one hand and a bolt-action hunting rifle braced in the crook of the other arm. "Don't move a goddamn inch. You're on private property, and that animal is my legal property. I've got every right under Manitoba law to hold you here until the RCMP arrive." Reed stepped in front of the group. His hands were visible and loose at his sides. He did not raise his voice. "Put the light down, Mr. Doucette. Nobody needs to make this difficult. You broke my fence and you're stealing my dog. You don't get to tell me what's difficult." Saoirse stepped out from beside Reed. In the beam of the flashlight, she looked younger than 28 and older at the same time. She stood with the careful deliberateness of someone whose hip reminded her it existed with every step. She held Gunnar's lead in both hands. "His designation is W09, she said. Her voice was steady and cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "He is a retired military working dog. 3 operational tours with Joint Task Force 2. He was transferred to a private contractor without my consent, while I was in hospital recovering from wounds sustained on active deployment. That contractor sold him at a government surplus auction for $85. I am his handler of record. I filed 3 separate adoption applications with the Department of National Defense from my hospital bed. Not one of them was processed." The flashlight moved from her face to the dog and back. "That's not my problem," Earl said, though with slightly less certainty than before. "I bought him legal." "I know you did," Saoirse said, "which is why I'm not here to make trouble for you." She reached into her jacket and produced a roll of bills, setting it on the flat top of the nearest fence post. $300. That's nearly 4 times what you paid. We leave tonight, and we don't come back." Earl's light stayed on her for a long moment. The rifle did not come up. Then his flashlight moved to the fence line, the section Luke had folded back, and his expression shifted from anger into something more calculating. He had 3 dogs in kennels on the south side of the property that had never been licensed, and 2 that had been acquired in ways he preferred not to document. The 4 people standing in his northeast yard moved with a particular economy that he had only seen in 2 other contexts in his life: wildlife officers executing a search warrant and soldiers he had watched on television during the news. He was not interested in being formally acquainted with any of them. He lowered the rifle. "Take the damn dog," he said. "He doesn't earn his keep anyway. Hips are shot." He turned and walked back toward the house without looking at them again. Saoirse picked up the roll of bills. She held it for a moment. Then she set it back on the fence post and walked toward the vehicles. Gunnar stayed pressed against her left side, matching her pace step for step, the way he had been trained to do years ago in a field on the outskirts of CFB Trenton. He did not look back at the property. They made it to the vehicles in under 4 minutes. Janelle had the rear cargo area of Saoirse's truck converted to a field treatment space before Gunnar was fully loaded. A camping mat layered with thermal blankets, a portable warming pad, IV supplies laid out on a folded jacket. She assessed him with the efficient, unhurried attention of someone who had performed field triage in worse conditions than this. severe malnourishment, significant dehydration. Core temperature is low, not critical, but low. The hip presentation is notable bilaterally. She found a vein on his foreleg with the ease of long practice, inserted the catheter, taped it down, and hung a bag of warmed saline and electrolytes from the grab handle above the window. His cardiac response is strong. He's a fighter. The fluid had barely begun to run when Gunnar exhaled, a long, deep release that moved through his whole body. The rigid alertness in his muscles let go in stages, like a structure finally permitted to settle. He laid his head across Saoirse's knee and closed his eyes. Outside, the first pale grey of a Manitoba winter dawn was beginning to separate the horizon from the sky. They had beaten the dark. The legal battle that followed was, in the words of the lawyer Saoirse retained, a remarkably clear-cut case of institutional negligence that had been dressed up in the language of administrative process. Blythe Corrigan was a 44-year-old barrister out of Ottawa who had spent 16 years at the intersection of Canadian Armed Forces administrative law and veteran advocacy. She had seen procurement mismanagement before. She had not seen it rendered this publicly documentable before, and she intended to make thorough use of that documentation. She did not simply file a petition. Within 48 hours of receiving Saoirse's complete file, the medical records, the 3 unprocessed adoption applications, the photographs Janelle had taken of Gunnar's condition at Doucet's property, and a precise administrative timeline of every decision made about W09 from the date of Saoirse's evacuation forward, Corrigan had contacted the parliamentary correspondents for 2 national newspapers and 3 television networks. The story ran on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the Minister of National Defence's office had received over 4,000 emails. By Saturday, a parliamentary petition had gathered 62,000 signatures. The Canadian Military Working Dog Association issued a formal public statement. A veterans advocacy group in Calgary retained separate legal counsel and filed a concurrent petition. Harley Bassett was placed on administrative leave within 72 hours of the story's publication. He was recalled before a parliamentary oversight subcommittee 6 weeks later. His testimony lasted 4 hours and satisfied no one on either side of the chamber. It was reported in full in both official languages. Meridian Security Solutions, facing a federal audit of its contracted animal welfare protocols, settled out of court and issued a written acknowledgement of procedural deficiencies in the handling of retired government working animals. Their federal contracts were not renewed in the subsequent fiscal cycle, a fact that was noted without comment in the company's annual report. The Department of National Defense retroactively reviewed and approved all 3 of Saoirse's adoption applications. W09 was formally reclassified as an honorably discharged military working veteran, with full recognition of his service record, effective the date of his first operational deployment. The paperwork arrived at Saoirse's apartment in Kingston on a Tuesday morning by registered mail. She read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and went to find Gunnar. He was asleep on the orthopedic mat she had ordered the week they arrived home from Manitoba, positioned in the corner of the living room, where he could see both the front door and the hallway. She sat on the floor beside him. He didn't fully wake, just shifted his head until it rested on her knee with a small, unconscious sigh. She left her hand on his side and listened to him breathe for a while. 8 months later, on a warm August afternoon on the eastern shore of Lake Ontario, Saoirse Gallagher stood at the waterline and threw a tennis ball as far down the beach as her rebuilt hip would allow. Gunnar was already moving before it hit the sand. He was unrecognizable from the animal that had stood rigid in a Manitoba wind the previous January. His coat was thick and dense, and caught the afternoon light in shades of tan and black that had no grey in them. The lost weight had returned, and healthy muscle had come with it. The bilateral hip dysplasia was managed with a combination of medication and a specific exercise protocol that Janelle had mapped out over a video call one Sunday afternoon in March, and while the slight hesitation in the rear right leg would never fully resolve. Janelle had been honest about that from the beginning. It slowed him down in no way that he appeared to notice. He hit the shallows at full speed, sent a wall of lake water into the August air, and came up with the tennis ball clenched in his jaws. He turned on the wet sand with the precision of a dog trained to pivot in narrow doorways and drove straight back toward Saoirse. He dropped the ball at her feet and sat at perfect attention. His amber eyes, clear now, not clouded with exhaustion but present and exact, found her face and held. The old scar crossed the bridge of his muzzle in a pale diagonal line, catching the afternoon sun the way scars do, not hidden, not a source of shame, but simply part of the record of what a life contains when it has been fully used. Saoirse knelt in the sand and scratched behind his ears, right over the faded W09 tattoo on the inner pinner, the ink blurred at the edges with age and weather, but still legible to anyone who looked. "Good boy," she said quietly. "We hold the line together, right?" Gunnar pressed his nose against her forehead and held it there for a moment, warm and certain. Then he barked once, clear and carrying, out across the water, and looked pointedly at the ball. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. But he was not doing it alone anymore, and on the shore of Lake Ontario on a warm August afternoon, with the ball at his feet and his handler kneeling in the sand in front of him, that was enough for both of them.